of West Oakland. This is Revolution. And today, I'm very excited about the guest I have on. I will be very honest. I'm not going to lie. I sometimes have people on this show that I am intellectually intimidated by. And the guest today is one of these people. He's extremely smart cat. And every time I see him, I was telling him before we were recording, every time I see him on the internet, he's always intellectually slapping the shit out of somebody. So I was the first interaction I had with our guest was there was a comment about neoliberalism somehow, and I said something about David Harvey, and he went off about David Harvey. And I was like, damn, he's mad at David Harvey, like David Harvey might have slept with his partner. So I don't know. I'm like, the man I am talking about is C. Derick Varn. His bio says he's an emerging poet.
Yeah.
I don't know if emerging is right. Let's just say he's a poet. He's a poet. He's a teacher and a theorist. He's lived all over the world, and he's worked as an English lecturer,
Mm-hmm.
in intercultural communication, as well as a high school teacher. And he's also see him on shows on Zero Books with Doug Lain. We are talking with C. Derick Varn.
Hi. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I was a lecturer, which is a fancy way of saying above an adjunct professor, but you'll never get tenure ever. So,
did you have the Ben Burgess sport coat with the patches on the elbows?
Oh no, I was lucky to get dressed. Yeah. Burgess and I actually share, like, we both did that gig in Korea, and not at the same time. We didn't actually meet then, but it was a way to, like, when you get your credentials kind of youngish, it's a way to buy time, and for me, it led to a completely different career path than for Ben. So,
teaching wise.
yeah, I mean, I went back into high school teaching because, believe it or not, internationally, that's where the money is. And when I say that's where the money is, as a person from two generations of poverty, taking you just kind of have to be a mercenary. Whenever I always talk to people about, like, recruiting teachers of color or whatever, because this is a big issue here out in Utah, and I'm always like, well, you have to just pay better. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, if you are going to be the first generation person in your family to go and spend the money and invest in higher education, you come from generational poverty, your parents would be stupid to let you be a teacher. Like, that's a waste of. I mean, it's an important job. Don't get me wrong, but, like, for on just a pure capitalist calculus, that's an irresponsible choice. And we all know that bougie white people are the people who get to make irresponsible choices. So, without consequence.
That's what we should call it. That's what we should call this episode: "Bougie White People and Irresponsible Choices."
Yeah.
With C. Derick Varn. That's very, it's funny. It is very true that they get to make those choices, and I don't think we understand that having a little bit of money and privilege allows you to go, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go teach in the hood for a minute. Because when you're from it, as I am, the last thing you want to do is start your life off in the place you're trying to leave.
Oh yeah, I mean that's true for, like. That's true for, the ex-urban South, the rural poor, red state areas too. I mean, not to give any validity to a crazy conservative douchebag like Thomas Sowell, but, like, there is a way where the the kind of shit kicker culture of, like, rednecks and the hood mirror each other in a lot of ways. One of the first things you're going to do when you have the money, our capital, our chance is to get the hell out of it if you are in any way inclined to do so.
Definitely. Oh yeah, no, they are very, very similar. I worked, maybe you'll find this funny, maybe you won't. I worked in North Dakota, cooking in a housing facility for oil field workers. And some of the people I worked with, kind of right-wing militia people. So not all of them. Just some, right? And one day we got in this conversation because this woman was talking about how the mindset of them was different than people in the inner city, like at gangs. And I was like, well, no, you sound like you're in a gang to me. And she goes, well, no, those people in gangs are different. I was like, well, how? Don't you have guns? She's like, well, of course. I was like, well, they have guns. What do you have guns for? She's well, to protect my property. I was like, well, what do you think they have guns for? She goes, well, they do things with their guns. I was like what? Like shoot people that they think are invading their territory? What do you do with your guns if I came on your property unannounced? She got so furious. So furious. I was like, look, man, you sound like a Crip to me. So you're just going to be the old Crip white lady right now. So she definitely didn't like that. But no, I agree with that point. Rednecks and there's a lot of that shit. A lot of similarities.
I mean, poverty culture is, it's one of the things about the left that, particularly the academic left, honestly, that sometimes sends me over into a wall, is like this romanticization of poverty culture. I don't like the demonization of it either. I mean, but there's some people, particularly in organizations like, I don't know, the DSA, might have this like pure noble savage worker, and they might be a person of color and they might be white depending on how they're feeling that day, and it is all squeaky clean, and we all know that's not how it works, and particularly if you're from it. I mean, it's one of the things is, if you get yourself out of those areas, you do have a tendency to be I mean, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of ex-working class people, and I'm gonna, are people who kind of go up intra-class, like, you start off on the shit end of the working class and you get kind of like a good, stable job. How you might end up kind of conservative-ish if you're not really careful, because you see a lot of the pathology of what poverty, and particularly generational poverty, can do to people. Because it isn't always pretty. I mean,
no, it's not. And that's I think that's important that you say that. Because I see it all the time, especially in my community. Somebody gets a few. There's a comedian that had a joke once. He was like, anybody that thinks they can make their rent and a car payment swears they're Oprah. And there's something to be said about, if you get a decent job and have a little bit of money, now you look back on the environment and you start doing things that maybe you didn't do before. Like, well, I'm going to watch Fox News. And they just keep reiterating the same narrative about why the hood is the way it is. And it has a lot to do with just, shitty people being shitty.
Right.
And I recently had to unfriend a friend since the second grade that had fallen down the Trumpy rabbit hole of get off your ass, N-word, and work. You know what I mean? And it's
who works more in this country?
but that's the thing. Like, if you see home, like I live across from this huge homeless encampment, and I mean, it's massive, and it's right across the street. Like, they're my neighbors, But you hear people say every day, like, oh, those people are just lazy. They don't want to work. They don't want this. Some people want to be homeless. I'm like, who the fuck wants to live in their car with rats as big as king size burritos running around? Like, no, who wants that?
I don't think so. I mean, it's funny. I think a little stint being homeless will change some people's minds. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. When I was a kid, my mom was a diner waitress and getting out of a complicated situation with her family after my dad left, and so we were home. I don't really remember this much of this, but we were homeless for like 4 or 5 months. She had a job. She was working homeless. She worked at the diner. Pretty much lived in a diner in the car until she put me with my grandparents. And so that those kind of realities, and in the early '80s, sort of stuck with me. And then I did a stint actually as an idiot. 18-year-old when I went out with a bunch of gutter punks and lived amongst squatters and the homeless for a while. And what was funny about that is that started off voluntary and didn't end up staying voluntary because that's a cycle.
Yeah.
Until I basically got into college. I sort of got out of it another way. Actually, I ended up going to, believe it or not, a Buddhist vihara around, which is a temple around Stone Mountain, and staying there until my parents got me and told me I got accepted into college.
Really?
So, yeah. So that was my little stint with that and that's really informative, but also I don't want to make it sound like I was systemically homeless. It was only for like a few months. And most of that, only about a month of that was really on the streets. Most of that was just jumping from couch to couch and then doing the whole, like, I'm going to be, I might as well find religion. Um, so yeah. But those things are informative to me. But I also remember when I got out of uni the first time, I got a job working for an insurance company. And before this, I'd always been, either like a pizza chef or an illegal loading docks worker or, whatever I could get. Right. And, uh, and I've been really good in school. I did have that advantage, but I had a lot of the disadvantages of, I didn't know how to game the testing system and all that. There's all this like upper middle class knowledge that you need in America, even if it was a true meritocracy, right? A true meritocracy, whatever the hell that is, because I'm just going to talk about how that can't be. There's all these social games you don't really learn how to play because you've just never been exposed to them. And in my case, because the generational poverty in my family was only in one line, I did have tangential exposure to, like, so that I gleamed a few things. Because my line was the line that had been broken and go to school. Like, they fell down in the 1920s, and one half, and the other half was like sharecroppers and dirt farmers going back forever. And so, but I did have, through extended family, people who had gotten proper educations or whatever. And so I kind of knew what I needed to figure out, but I didn't really know how to do it. And I had to learn it all the hard way in college. And so college for me was both an opening up a whole new world, but it was also class warfare all the time.
That's interesting. You didn't go to an Ivy League, did you?
I did not. In fact, I didn't really start dealing with Ivy League people until way after I had gotten my master's of fine arts. I went to a liberal arts university that was public, that was near where I grew up, and then I learned how to play school. I'm one of those people who got better and better at school as I got older because I learned the game of which school is. And so it was something to really, that was really, really fascinating about what. But the point of this story is when I first got out, between my experiences, like I come out of I come out of like you can kind of tell I come out of like a kind of redneck punk scene. But between my experiences and my exposure to like Chomsky and stuff from zine culture in the late 90s and my like being anti-war, because so many of the people I knew from Central Georgia were sucked up into the Iraq War, and they all came back weird.
Interesting.
And so, my concerns were, I wanted the community that I grew up with, which was, my specific community was this little town outside of Macon called Gray that was about 50% black and 50% white, roughly. And it was actually weird in the late 90s ex-urban rural South interface, in that there wasn't a private school for white flight to happen. So it really, truly was economically and racially diverse. And so I wanted, the end of the immiserated conditions for my community, because it was just getting shittier and shittier. Even though the 90s were a good time, it wasn't that great for us. And it was getting worse. By the time that 9/11 happened, my community was getting particularly deracinated. And you can look up stats on Macon and the Macon area. If you're not attached to the military or prisons, you're basically screwed. And my mother did work her way out of being a waitress or whatever, and having a bunch of kids. And she became a nurse, but she became a nurse at a time that was really bad for nurses in Georgia, so she became a prison nurse. So my late high school years and college years were spent a lot around prison, and some of my, I'm not super proud of this actually, but one of my first jobs was around, was correctional guard.
Were you?
For a little while.
No shit.
And that turned me against prisons immediately.
You're either going to go one or two ways. I have a good friend of mine that's been a prison guard for 20 years. He's our age. Mm-hmm. And you go the other way too.
Yeah, I know some people who do. When I was working in Egypt as a teacher, I worked with one of the guys I worked with was also an ex-prison guard, but we were both like, yeah, I don't know. Corporal punishment's way more humane. Like I would much rather be caned, and I'm not advocating regime
for caning,
but I would personally much rather be caned than spend 5 years in a prison. Like that isn't even a hard question, right? Because that's what prisons do to people. So my concerns when I got out of college were largely around that. But this impulse, because I also had a decent job. I had I'd made myself, and and I'd met these leftists around International Answer, who would go out to these protests. Particularly the one I really remember was Sea Island, which was the second G8 protest, the one that happened after. It was the successor to the Battle for Seattle, but it happened after 9/11. And the way International Answer behaved, we were all sort of just mortified. And you know who was there to snap people like me up? Antiwar.com people. And
really?
So I got pulled into the rightosphere for about 2 years. Mostly, actually, I didn't even think of myself as political. I just cared about, opposing the war. And then, lo and behold, I'm like talking to people adjacent to Pat Buchanan. And a lot of that came from my own resentment from my class origins and being tired of fighting with with a lot of people who were culturally left wing, who I felt like were signifying class superiority to me. And that petty resentment, and I know Nietzsche's a reactionary philosopher, right? But what Nietzsche says about resentment is true. That petty resentment really drove me into this kind of right-wing politics, even though it was also framed for myself as being anti-war. I didn't see myself as being adjacent to racist until later. I didn't realize it. Anyway, I thought I wanted to help I wanted to help the community where I come from. The community where I come from is 50% black. So, that was my agenda. And I felt like the beginnings of I started seeing the beginnings of the financial crisis in 2005, right before it was really common. I was just seeing all these houses, and I'm like, we don't have the population for this, and this is farmland. Why are we doing that?
Big ass houses for no reason in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. I worked in that world. I started to see it too around that time too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think people who did work in this world were like, "This is a little weird," and I also became a high school teacher because, as anyone who's ever done it, being an adjunct professor when you're 25 is, I made more money working for Papa John's. So
Damn.
So I I had gone from working for insurance into getting my graduate degree and becoming an adjunct professor, and then I became a high school teacher, and I just immediately noticed when I entered the high school that I had all these black kids that were super smart, but they were never in my honors classes. And then I started looking into the housing crisis, and then I started. So there was just a bunch of things in my daily life that, just because I wanted to do my job well, actually, that I started figuring out, I had to figure out how to explain. And the narratives I was getting, even from the anti-war right, because I've never been a Republican, okay, so was it just didn't explain any of it to me. It really didn't. It didn't explain why, the personal choice stuff. Well, then why are all these poor people obese? Because they work. It's not because they're just lazy. I see them working. And just stuff like that. All those little things. You just think well, the trying to do anything. My ex-wife was working at the time. Was also working in she didn't have she never finished college because she had another working class tragedy story. She had a bandsaw cut her tendon when she was studying music while she was working in an injection factory in Pennsylvania, actually.
Jesus.
And so it ended her musical career and ended her college career concurrently. And the jobs she could get were payday loan lenders, and we also would just watch people come in and out of that. That they would go there out of desperation, that it really wasn't choice, and it was so expensive to be poor.
Yeah.
And so, people deal with me on this very highfalutin intellectual philosophical level, right? And I guess I'm telling you the stories because that part of me is all real, but it comes out of trying to answer the question of why is stuff so messed up, and why should I stop denying my working, why should I let some argument I had with some silly college pink hair when that meant something different in 2004 make me a weird reactionary when I'm seeing all this stuff in my community that I just do not want. And I can either stick my head in the sand and start watching Fox News or whatever, because for my area, I should also point this out, for my area, being a teacher, even though people think it doesn't pay well, and in many ways it doesn't for the amount of education and debt you take on. But for my area, being a teacher put me in the top 15% of income earners. So I knew things were bad. And I was really into that world, and I really wanted to make it better. And when I started getting into politics, this was out of this anti-war right-wing stuff and into slightly more radical politics. But my first foray is in 2007 was being interested in Mike Gravel, and then when Mike Gravel dropped out of the race and tried to run as a libertarian, I got interested in Obama, kind of symbolically. But I also followed politics really well. And when Obama appointed his cabinet, I swear to you, like 24 hours, I was like reading Das Kapital. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not much. I was just like
that cabinet, man, was and I'm looking at stuff for Biden's cabinet, and that kind of leads me into my next question. I think a lot of people share your story from the perspective of you see how effed it is to be poor, how, like you said, how expensive it is to be poor, and you ask yourselves these questions like, well, how why, and your friends and family will be like, well, it's just those people. And it's always on the person. It's never systemic. And the people that say anything about, say, oh, here are those people. Here come the pink hair people that tell you about all the problems with the system. It's not the problem with the system. The problem is Johnny smokes crack. That's the problem. Brenda is a meth head, and that's the problem. It's not the system. It's Brenda's a meth head. I'm like, okay, well, why is Brenda a meth head? Like, there's got to be a reason why. Like, no, we're not going to go any deeper than that. Like, that's where we're going to stop it. Just say no.
And we also aren't going to pay attention to how many rich people do different drugs. Like Brenda is a meth head, and somebody else smokes crack, and yet like cocaine is rampant. I don't know.
No, you're right. I agree. And I feel like a lot of people don't see that or even understand that, because the way we look at drug culture, it's only a certain person. And any movie about drugs, like even if it's like a Wolf of Wall Street type movie,
right?
This guy's doing buttloads of blow off everybody's ass, and then something tragic happens, and he sees some sort of light, and he's the lovable scoundrel that does all the cocaine. We can't have a lovable scoundrel in these other like movies, right?
No, you don't ever have the lovable crackhead. And as a side note, in my life when I lived in Macon, there are plenty of lovable crackheads. So
yes,
not that I would not want to get them clean as fast as I could if I could, but they were not as uncharming and as derelict and dangerous as everyone makes them out to be. I mean, but it was a very depressing world. I mean, and talking about, I mean, I think you wanted to talk about neoliberalism, and this is a very personal way to get to it. But neoliberalism and the way it affects us, right? A lot of people on the left, neoliberalism's come to mean like basically kind of a political conspiracy to return back to laissez-faire capitalism. When you actually dig into it, and like someone like David Harvey does a political history that talks about that, and none of David Harvey's history is false. I want to like go ahead and say this, and like despite like the fact that I treat David Harvey like he like beat my mother.
Oh yeah, you went off on him bad. Yeah. You went off on him real bad, and you know what's funny? So certain people start showing up, and you know this as well as I do, D. Certain people start showing up in your social media, like Facebook, who you should know, and guess who showed up in mine? Motherfucking David Harvey. I was like, man, I don't know who the fuck I know that knows you, but wow. And then I was like, how funny would this be if I got these two to talk? But he's just too British. I do.
He's a bit. I mean,
I think where is he at? He teaches out here somewhere in the States, isn't he?
Yeah, he does. I can't remember where. One of the things I'll give David Harvey credit, even though like I'm constantly basically indirectly, because I've never met him, argue with him, is that his lectures on Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3 were very helpful for me when I was first digging into it, even though I think about half of what he says is wrong. it was enough of a guide to keep me reading it that I could even think that. So, you know, maybe there's some anxiety of influence, particularly with David Harvey. You know how we all turn on our first encounter. But I read David Harvey's History of Neoliberalism, and I thought, oh, hey, okay, this sort of explains what's going on, but not enough. Like, it doesn't go into what happened with the unions. Why does my, you know, working class dad, who works, you know, he's a mechanic, works in the he's worked in the auto industry for 35 years. Why did he hate the auto unions? Because my father's not, like, particularly as time has progressed, has become less and less right wing. In the 80s, he was a little bit Law and Order, you know, and all the icky implications that implies. But but he never believed in, like, he thought private insurance was like a swindle all his life. Was always talking about the public option. He supported Ross Perot in the 90s.
Can it finish?
Right. As I like to refer to him as H. Ross Quixote, because it was a thing in my house when I was growing up. But I've seen him grow out of that and become very, very left wing, and even, like, I would say structurally anti-racist, even though maybe personally he probably still has some deep-seated bigotries because, you know, he grew up in the South before the civil rights movement really took hold. So how are both those things true? And I started looking out for other deeper explanations about why neoliberalism happened, because I wanted to understand, one, why were there these weird carve-outs? Like, why do we live in this neoliberal society, yet my community was totally dependent on the military to survive? Without the military, central Georgia dries up, and it has been drying up for
40 years.
40 years, yeah. As the military largesse has been consolidated and moved to places that it can kind of compound on each other, and actually as even military Keynesianism has been increasingly privatized and neoliberalized. So what did that get to? And so that was my issue with Harvey, is because I thought Harvey gave me a superficial explanation, but when I dug into it, I discovered that neoliberalism started earlier and was able to take advantage of a couple of specific sets of conditions, that some of which are political, some of which are economic, some of which have to do with the rates of profit, that made it less of a political will issue and more of like a perfect storm of conditions that these sort of, I hate to like make it sound like they were a nefarious conspiratorial think tank, because they weren't, but they kind of were. These sort of, old half German, half English European intellectuals were able to pounce on as a form of policy.
You're talking about Hayek and
Hayek and the Mount Pelerin Society.
Okay, yeah.
How were they able to do that? And why did neoliberalism really start under? Neoliberalism in earnest really started at the very, very end of the Nixon administration and was maintained during the Carter administration. And what was the crisis perpetuating that? It was what in economic terms we call an exogenous shock, right? A shock from outside the system because of oil that accelerated the business cycle. And you had a point in 1970s where if you looked at profits, you will notice that commodity production reached a point where not only was it not very profitable, it was actually negatively profitable. Now, from any standard economic, not just a Marxist one, but any standard economic analysis of history, like, that generates a crisis and also theoretically shouldn't happen. Now, Marxists do have a theory in which it happens, but for everybody else, theoretically shouldn't happen. So what was going on? And you will notice the two things that really begin is the labor movement in the developed world had kind of made a lot of pacts with management and with the government. Taft-Hartley really gutted the labor movement, but it didn't push back on it much because during the 1950s, the core of the capitalist economy was flush with money. George Kennan, the realpolitik guy who used to work for the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, have pointed out, partly by imperialism and partly by just being the last highly productive modernized economy standing after World War II, 50% of the world's wealth was in the 5% of the population in the United States. And so management could afford to have détente with workers through Fordism, and the state could, whether you believe it's a Ford or at least have the political viability to run something like MMT after the quote-unquote recouping of the war profits in the 50s. Recouping being like, if you looked at the actual taxation rates on marginal income in the 1950s under Eisenhower, it could be up to 80%. So they were
the top marginal tax rate.
Yeah.
And do you want to explain real quick what Fordism is, real quick?
Yeah, sure. Fordism was this idea propagated by noted racist Henry Ford that if you pumped enough private equity into the factory and also had your own workers as a consumer base, that you could actually booster up profits through taking care of your workers, and also making them loyal to you and thus more productively efficient. Mm-hmm. And Fordism, interestingly, only ever seemed to work in like what you would see, what we might call in sort of world system theory or Marxism, like the core imperialist economies. This led to some like weird Maoist theories I'm not going to go into, but like, and this is this period when we think of America in a lot of ways, both on the left and on the right, actually. This is the period we're thinking about. Even when people talk about the New Deal, what they're thinking about is all the social programs that started really working and paying off by the end of the 40s and 1950s, when we are also flush with money from World War II. All right. So how does that have to do with neoliberalism? Well, we have all this money going around. We also, because we have all this money going around, but we're still pegged to the gold system, so we can't truly free float our currency yet. Like, I'm currently in debates with MMTers. It's the only people I'm really willing to debate because I think it's productive. But this is I just want to bracket out for people who think that I don't understand what MMT's claims. In this time period, we are still tied to the gold standard, so we can't float our currency, and so we're trying to recoup all that. And we're clearly the imperial hegemon, and in the West, you start seeing these crises hit. I mean, we think about 1968 in France, right? It was partially prompted by unemployment, but we're talking about an unemployment ratio that was an increase of like 2% to 4%. Like, we can hardly imagine a 4% unemployment ratio in the United States, and good God, in Europe. Okay? Like, so we're dealing with a very different time. And we often set our norms for like what the norms of American society are in this half a generation that was so flush with this money. And that's this endogenous shock with oil, and we were all tied up in the petrodollar. I mean, at the time, that seemed to be more than like the traditional commodities that you dealt with, like gold, seemed to be what the dollar was really tied up in, because it was tied up in international trade. This OPEC external shock accelerated the business cycle super fast, and you had that condition that all the right-wing economists talk about all the time, called stagflation, which is something that theoretically, according to Keynesian norms, should not have happened. And I thought, okay, that was the normal explanation, and then I started looking into profitability, not just because of oil, but across the board, and you have profitability declines. So what immediately even conventional economists will tell you starts happening in the 70s is what they'll call financialization. which is a nice word for inflating things through paper assets. But the other thing they really needed to do was discipline labor. And one of the ugly truths about American progressivism that I don't think people have really dealt with enough is business actually figured out a way to weaponize a good and valid point of feminism. All right. So there was this big push for particularly, lower class women to enter the workforce. Household income stagnated during this time period. Notice I said housecome, not individual. What does that tell you that the employers use women entering the workforce to do?
To lower wages?
They used it to lower wages by increasing competition. Now, there's no reason why that has to happen, all right? Because labor markets are not actually closed they're not actually closed in that. But in a nation, if you can use a massive quick increase into the labor market to kind of freeze things, particularly if you're not doing it directly. So they're not lowering wages in a way that you will know, that you'll see. All right. So how are they lowering wages? Well, why is the what is it, like the $1.50 minimum wage from 1960 actually less than the fight for 15? I mean, more than the fight for 15 now, right? It's called inflation. So they were able to keep nominal wages flat and real wages dropping. Okay, so that's part of the picture. Now, I'm always hesitant to talk about that part of the picture because I don't want to sound anti-immigrant or anti-women entering the workforce, because I don't really think it had to be this way. That's just how it was used. So then you had this fiscalization going on. So you had to create all these paper assets, moving a whole lot of assets into banking and other what a lot of people would see as quasi-productive or non-productive economic relationships. And then you started seeing the creation of markets. Now, I find it interesting that a lot of people think neoliberalism is laissez-faire capitalism. When you look at people who promote true, and I'm putting in quotation marks because we all know true laissez-faire capitalism has probably never actually existed. But true laissez-faire capitalism were people like Ludwig von Mises and the early Austrian school. And they knew von Hayek and all those guys, and they called them socialists. So, yeah, for real. And they also called them monetarists, which is like the Chicago end of this, which is the Milton Friedman types. They called them socialists too, for
Weird.
things like tax credits and all that. And no, they wanted nothing. Neoliberalism. If you look, the scholar who's been really influential to me on this is a scholar named Philip Murawski, was super pernicious, because what it did is saying, oh no, there's still a place for government, but the government's going to create public-private partnerships as opposed to just funding these things outright. All right. So instead of having true privatized education, private schools, and by the way, I don't think you'll ever see super profitable for-profit private schools without massive government intervention, such as no interest loans and protections from being sued, because education involves tons of labor with no tangible commodity for which you can really make money out without the state intervening through limiting access by credentialing, through limiting access by intellectual property law. If you really think about it, neoliberalism relies on things like intellectual property law, creation of markets, public-private partnerships, charter schools, block funding to states as opposed to direct funding through the feds. So you'll notice those are not true laissez-faire interventions. And they also tend to focus on what we would call in economic terms rentier markets as opposed to commodity markets. So rentier markets are captured. They don't really work off of what, supply and demand or scarcity models that we use in all other pricing. All right? Because the profits on those things drop. So what the neoliberals managed to do was encourage a set of policies and government investment, and they initially even got relatively left-wing governments to do it to try to save their welfare states. To liberalize these, but they didn't make them truly laissez-faire. They created all these government-created short markets and stuff. Now, if you go back into the deep history of capitalism, you'll know that that's kind of always how it's worked. Like, capitalism didn't just emerge because kings were like, "Oh, you can trade." Like, if you like, and I think that interestingly enough, it's a modern monetary theorist who talk the most about this. But if you, and in a weird way, but I'm not getting into that right now because I don't want to get into that fight. If you look at the history of what was done to Africa, it actually mirrors what Europe did to itself. The local agrarian economy in South Africa, for example.
Are you talking post-apartheid?
I'm talking pre-apartheid.
Okay.
I'm talking about how apartheid started, actually.
Gotcha.
The local agrarian in South Africa, even when the British got there, the native tribes, even the ones that were agricultural and not hunter-gatherer, they didn't want to have to trade on a market. They could grow enough from their soil because it was funkin' enough to survive fine and be happy. So how did they get them to get into the market? They compelled them through hut taxes. They compelled them through limiting traditional land inheritance, making it going through a quote-unquote nuclear family model. They did this even through like private charter companies. They didn't even technically do it through the government. And then they instilled that in South Africa proper. Cecil Rhodes, when he was, I believe, the president of South Africa, the president of the colony of South Africa, to compel that, but was afraid of labor unrest, and God forbid you start having these newly forced to work Africans point out that these white settlers who are being exploited are also not that different from them. So apartheid had to be imposed as well. So anyway, that's early capitalism. But this neoliberal capitalism sort of comes up with a really slick way to do something similar. So we can create all these public-private partnerships, but we're still creating the markets through tax funds. And there's all these enforcement mechanisms that shouldn't exist if this is a truly laissez-faire market. So this is where I kind of not disagree, but have a more complicated view than David Harvey does from the work of Philip Mirowski. Because when you really look at it, Obamacare is neoliberal. All right, what does it do? It mandates you participate in a private market with no price controls. It does not fund that market except on the margins, so that the obvious results of a compelled private market with no price controls, which is like they can charge whatever they want, you can't do anything about it, will be mitigated by the government coming in and doing expansions of Medicare, quasi remediation moves. But that is a neoliberal answer to that. You see that with charter schools too. All right. Now, charter schools are great grifts, right? If you've studied charter schools, like more than what they do to education, I actually think they do make public schools work. Some of the freedoms that you get in charter schools are interesting and useful, and that was why, for example, something like a charter school, what became the basis for charter schools, was actually proposed by the teachers' unions themselves in the 80s in New York, which were like these schools where certain labor, are not so much labor, but standards and standards were relaxed. You could try a more experimental enclosed system as an experiment. And politicians realized, we can take that and combine it with having private entities run this for profit in some cases, but pay them through tax dollars. Again, does that sound laissez-faire to you?
That's the public partner, the public-private partnership that you're talking about.
Right. And you will notice so many economic relations after the 80s operate this way. I mean, why don't we have welfare anymore? Well, we can give block grants to states to compel these people to enter the labor market Now we're going to have this really disgusting and damning and racist campaign to make this popular, but we're also going to we're going to create places for these people to go. There'll be work programs for them, public-private partnerships again. It's not truly laissez-faire capitalism. I mean, partly because, as I was going into the early history of capitalism, there isn't truly laissez-faire capitalism, but partly because also they realized, I think they really didn't know, that the profitability problem when you have commodity money, which is money like gold, and you are producing commodities which become normalized, and they eventually hit a point where the prices drop from competition, the prices drop from efficiency, the prices drop from overabundance and aggregate demand, that you couldn't make profits off of it anymore. So you needed to make profits two ways: really complicated financial instruments, which created a lot of paper, a lot of credit and debt, which is also like a long part of the history of currency and capitalism, right? Way before modern times. But this was a really way to zone in on that and create a bunch of public-private partnerships. All of these actually involved a very strong state that actually intervenes in your life to make you participate in the market. That's a little bit different of a narrative than what you hear about neoliberalism. Oh, it's laissez-faire. They're opening up all these public goods to private ownership, and they're just making us all compete in the rat race. It's even worse than that. They are.
I feel like it's a word. Do you feel this way, Derick? And I know you kind of, I don't want to say exist in both worlds of left and right, but I mean, you and I feel like we don't just live in a world of just left media, right?
Yeah, I don't.
Just family alone. I don't live in a world of just consuming nothing but the Majority Report.
Yeah, correct.
I feel like the word neoliberalism is only said on the left. I don't really hear it when I watch MSNBC and CNN and Fox News.
No, they don't use it. However, I mean, originally it was a right-wing word.
The show I had last night, I did a live stream last night with Dr. Jack Rasmussen. He said that he doesn't really like the word at all. He said that he didn't use that word back in the day. He said they called it class consciousness.
Right. Well, one of the things I think that's really pernicious about the way we use neoliberalism now, actually, is we could be referring to the specific periodization in capitalism that we exist in right now. That has this weird public-private partnership area, and in which case I'm down with you, although most people don't know what you're talking about. Like, they don't live in a world where that is explained. Or it's used by leftists to basically mean capitalism, and it removes the class element of the debate. It makes it sound like this is only a political policy fight, which it is not.
That's interesting. You had said something about that, somebody, because you know what, that whole thread that I'm talking about David Harvey, I think I actually had mentioned his name first and set you off, and then a bunch of other people wanted to chime in. So I will take blame for starting that fire.
Yeah. You one of your first interactions with me was just you happened to step into one of my bugaboos by accident. But
yeah.
But when you look at David Harvey, and if people want to learn about neoliberalism, David Harvey's book is a great place to start, but do not end there. All right, I don't even think David Harvey would tell you to end there. Actually, I think this public-private partnership stuff though is really important because it can be framed in an either right-wing or left-wing way. And when I say left-wing, it's not really left-wing, but you can sell this to even fairly progressive Democrats if you package it right. And I think the designers of the policy knew that. But when we talk about capitalism, we should talk about capitalism because you got to deal with class and things that this debate seems to hide.
Well, and that's another word that is just you're never going to hear on those main networks.
Or that's going to be defined in a really weird income-based way that doesn't explain much, like people who are working class make under $25,000 a year. Like,
yeah.
whatever that means. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I even think, and I hate to knock on Brother Bernie. Not really, but I kind of do. Even that 99%, 1% rhetoric is obscuring of this, right? Because really it's 90%, 10%, 1, or like 90%, 9.9%, and 0.1%. It's like what you're actually dealing with when you look at the breakdown. You have a like 10% buffer class of like wealthy people who technically have a relationship to the wage fund, but also own enough capital indirectly through owning stocks, and having that sort of access to markets where they're in a almost hybrid position from a Marxist standpoint. And you kind of have to look at but the super rich people, they're so far removed from your life. Most people aren't even angry with them. And in fact, they're not even going to always take what we would think as like regressive or Republican stances, right? They're not, because they have enough money that, we can give the Democrats something to shut the holy polloi up. Like, they're not going to be against that, particularly if the Republicans overplay their hands. If you look at the government right now as the way to manage the conflicts between different sectors of capitalism, and also kind of keep the population happy enough that we don't burn everything down, then you can see that the super rich may not even be the people who are going to seem the most reactionary to you. They don't care about stuff like gay marriage. They don't. They care about they care about the structural global racism. But you could have a more diverse board of directors. That's fine. They still have all the stocks.
Didn't George Soros give Black Lives Matter a whole bunch of money?
Yeah.
and Reverend Barber too, the war on poverty.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfectly good it's a good grift, man. I mean, there is a problem. There is a way people can take this problem of woke capitalism and turn it into like this weird white only workerist thing. I'm sure you've seen it too.
I have. What's that? Are you talking about the one lady that says something about if you say working class, then you're a racist?
Yeah, or reverse. Yeah, stuff like that. You can see it on both sides. Like you can have these people who are like Ivy League and do that crap, or you can have people who can make it sound like if you care about like racial issues that you're really like distracting from the class war or whatever. I know some of those people,
by saying working class.
No, but are the opposite. Like if you're not talking about working class all the time, or if you ever think working class people could ever be bigoted, all right, I'm going to use bigoted as opposed to racist, because racism has like 3 different meanings really.
Yeah.
Then or maybe we shouldn't care about these purple hairs again, as if working class people don't have purple hair sometimes. It also is funny. It's like, have you not known anyone at your 7-Eleven who is transparently queer? Like, quit that shit. But you know who I'm talking about, like the socialist respectability crowd, actually. And then their mirror opposite, which is like any talk of class is racist because it's trying to erase concerns about race.
That's just silly.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's
that's all you can say is like, oh, you're just silly.
It's not like the various people who make up people of color don't have classes amongst themselves and in general. I mean, my God. There's a black bourgeoisie too.
Yeah. There is. There was a good, I don't know if you watch Democracy Now, but Juan from Democracy Now actually did a huge takedown on the Democratic Party and the Latino vote. And he kind of got into it, how, they're not a monolith. They're not all Mexicans. The Latino vote is a complicated vote, and
it's not even Mexicans versus Cubans as the way it's often portrayed too. It's way more complicated than that, and
way more complicated.
And also, people from Latin countries bring their own and very different settler, colonial, and indigenous assumptions to our culture too. Our culture in quotation marks, whatever that is, and they intermix. So you have colorism, you have all these things that frankly, because of our own cultural norms and our own binary view, quasi-binary views of race, we don't even know how to deal with, in America. That doesn't mean it isn't pernicious and colonialist. It doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of people who are hyper-conservative. That doesn't mean that there's not inter-minority racism. There's not inter-minority systemic racism in the same way. I mean, you might want to use the term anti-blackness and anti-Latin and anti-Asian sentiment or something, but that definitely exists, and anyone who's come from those communities knows that. I mean, in some degree, there's also going to be a relationship to hierarchy and aggression and whatnot that has a normal distribution amongst mammals in general that might look like what we think of as the left-right spectrum in some ways, and that exists in all peoples. Now, I actually don't like talking about that as a left-right spectrum because I don't really think it is, but it can superficially look like that. And so it can throw people off. But there's clearly there's petite bourgeois. I mean, particularly amongst immigrants, right? Because one of the pernicious things about racism in a very interesting way, if you're an immigrant, you come here, get ahead, you might be able to, but you're also going to have a hard time in a lot of places getting an entry-level job unless you're very highly qualified coming to the States. So what are you going to do? You're going to open up your own business. Well, that changes your material concerns from, say, people who are, shut out of the labor market entirely and don't have any capital to open up their own business and are forced into either state dependency or into, frankly, lumping criminality. You're going to be, and you have different interests from people who are low wage earners in your own community, even if you're both relatively poor, because where your surplus value is going to be different. And that can go a long way to explaining how not monolithic any voting bloc is. Why would the Black community in particular be so democratic right now? I mean, some people talk about, the Civil Rights Act, but the thing that actually historically did it is FDR, right? I mean, FDR kept the Dixiecrats and the segregationists in the Democratic coalition, but so why did African Americans vote for FDR? Because they got jobs.
Well, didn't they vote for him the second time, right? Because I believe the first time around,
the first time they did not. They didn't trust him.
They voted for Hoover, yeah.
Because he was from the same party as Wilson, and we all know Wilson was a segregationist. He actually resegregated parts of the federal government. Yep. I mean, I know we all. So that's. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
No, go ahead.
No, it's just that irony has always sat with me my entire life, particularly when I was a kid, and I would even hear liberals talk about how great Wilson was, and the League of Nations, and international cooperation, and his actual policies. I mean, they're finally being discussed, but you would have never heard that in the 90s or even most of the aughts.
Was Wilson the one that shows Birth of a Nation in the White House, or is that Coolidge? I always get them confused.
Wilson, I think it was Coolidge. I know Coolidge had the second Klan do a rally, but Wilson still had just as many connections to the Klan.
It's interesting when we start talking about voting this year around, because there's a lot more we're talking about than we didn't talk about in 2008. And I go back to 2008 because Joe Biden was Barack Obama's VP. And you even said that you were looking at Obama as a viable candidate. The The hope and change rhetoric was very contagious. Let's not lie. And he's a great public speaker. I watched Barack Obama recently on David Letterman.
Mm-hmm.
And I got it. I was like, I forgot that this guy gets in front of a camera. He's very, very smooth. And he's just, in my lifetime, he's probably the best presidential public speaker I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah, easily.
Do you disagree?
I agree. I mean, I totally agree. He doesn't have some of the... He's an amazing speaker. I will say, he has affectations that if you are certain kinds of working class, you will either look up to as aspirational or have a revulsion to.
Yes. And I definitely know people that did not like him. And there was also people that didn't like him because he was the colored dude from Chicago, Hawaii, wherever you want to say he's from.
But
yeah.
My own experience with that is interesting. I mean, like, I knew a lot of people in the Deep South who hated his guts. And then I knew people who I had experienced as being racist my entire life, who were like, he seems like he's got our interest at hand. We don't have a problem with
him. And he gets called now.
Mm-hmm.
He was getting called somewhat then, but no one could hear to the level they hear now, a neoliberal. And the knock on Biden, and we're not going to get into the 94 crime bill and the wars. We'll just stay with neoliberalism. Is that he represents the neoliberalism that is the Democratic Party in 2020.
Well, aside from Bernie Sanders and maybe AOC, who doesn't?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have the squad, you have your DSA endorsed candidates, although in a pure game theoretic way, they are so against the wall now.
Yeah.
And who doesn't? I mean, and that's one of the interesting things. One of the things, if you get on the very far right, like are like into like really activated Trumpist or even Alex Jones world, they also hate neoliberals.
Mm-hmm.
Although partly because I think they just hear the word liberal. But
you think it's just the word liberal?
no, I actually, because what Alex Jones and crew hate about it, and this even came up in my own. I gave you my personal history at the beginning of our conversation here, but this came up in my own personal history. When I was my first foray into any politics at all, I was, a zine punk rocker, poor working class kid from the South. I had some friends who were better off than me. We saved up a bunch of money because we had been, we're in the punk rock scene, so we have some nascent political consciousness, even if it's like gutter punking.
Yeah. And that's how I found out who Pol Pot was, man.
Yeah, exactly. I found out who Mumia Abdul-Jamal was from that too.
Right? So yeah.
And maybe I'll tell you a story about being a fairly poor working class white kid who goes into the black community trying to proselytize in the Deep South about Mumia Abdul-Jamal. Jamal got treated.
That might be a whole episode. That might be a whole episode for it.
What is wrong with you? And somebody's like, "You probably shot that cop." And I'm like, "Oh my god, I don't understand." But anyway,
they would have shot that cop.
And that's kind of a funny story of a 14-year-old. But like, so I'm in the punk rock scene, and we save up money and we go to the Battle of Seattle. And I didn't actually even realize it at the time. But at the Battle for Seattle, and I was 17. So I was young. And I had never left my state really before, except for when my father had moved me to another country briefly. But like, other than those trips, I had lived in Georgia.
And you went all the way across country?
All the way across country, straight across to Seattle.
On a Greyhound?
Yeah. with 3 friends, 17 years old. We got involved in the protest. I bring this up, though, because Pat Buchanan was there at the Battle for Seattle. Little known fact, but he was. All right. There is this time period where the Alex Jonesy types, and particularly during the anti-war rhetoric, where they really thought that the old paleo conservatives, who, you know, some of them are fascist adjacent. I mean, literally. I mean, Richard Spencer used to work at Amcom magazine.
Really?
Yeah, really. They erased that. He didn't work there for long, but he was like the arts editor after he finished his master's thesis on Adorno, of all people.
I refuse to believe that.
Nope, true fact. And so that group was really good at talking about how globalism was against your economic self-interest, and so I was exposed to them tacitly, even at the Battle for Seattle, right? Because they also saw the neoliberals as a threat to nationalism. So this is like pre-Steve Bannon stuff, and this has been a low-grade issue on the beyond normal Republican spectrum for 30 years or more. All right, since really they kind of got ousted during the Reagan administration, and they got kicked out of the National Review for being racist. They were also adjacent to Birchers, because the Birchers also saw these neoliberals and their public-private partnerships and their international cooperation as probably a communist plot. And for a while, people like Alex Jones, particularly during the Obama years, would try to get leftists really angry at the neoliberal policies and the refusal to get out of Afghanistan, and the kind of back and forth from the Iraq War, and the refusal to really stand up and close Gitmo, and all.
Well, he was pretty anti-war. Like I had do you know Robbie Martin, Abby Martin's brother?
Yeah.
He was on Alex Jones' show, and he was on my show.
Yeah. And so I knew about all those people from both sides of the weirdo fringe political divide, right? Like, I mean, I have been in, unfortunately, and somewhat infamously, like I've been like 2 steps removed from Richard Spencer because of people I knew during the anti-war movement.
That's crazy.
Particularly in Georgia, because the National Policy Institute, which has a very innocuous name but is a Nazi front, is out of Augusta, which is the town I was born in. So like that world did actually try to make inroads into the anti-neoliberal left. You even saw it in strategies around rightists being willing to write for things like Counterpunch. And back when like RT would have leftists and rightists on an equal number, that's not true anymore. But they would in the Obama years they did. It was also part of Russian geopolitical strategy. I'm not a Russiagatist. Don't come yell at me. But it is part of Russian geopolitical strategy. And so all these things existed in the fight against neoliberalism, which is why I insist on really knowing what it is. But I also think like we should actually be aiming at fighting capitalism, right? And don't let people weasel word you out on what capitalism is, because I don't think a lot of people have, even though that is a word you hear in the media all the time, have a working definition of capitalism, or they have it. It's like we have free trade between markets. I hate to tell you, but all societies on Earth, at least between groups, have had something akin to markets. All right. Yeah. Now, very hunter-gatherer groups don't, but you get any more complex than that. There are ways of exchange, and there are taxation regimes and coercion that resembles markets. And it's not capitalism, because there's no wage relationship in that society from which anyone can make money off of anybody else's labor. That is, to me, the defining thing about capitalism. We can't all be entrepreneurs. It would not work. Everyone who knows anything about economics, including the right-wingers who sell you entrepreneurial myths, know this. Right?
But that was the whole thing. That's what kind of pissed me off about the whole. I don't know if you follow that Ice Cube shit with Donald Trump and the Platinum Plan, or whatever. But it was kind of like that same thing. Like, we're just going to have a whole bunch of colored Bezoses in the hood, and that's that's what equality looks like.
That's an old strategy. I mean, Alex Garland, Alex Garland, the writer of Roots and of the ghostwriter of the autobiography of Alex Haley, not Garland. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Thank you for correcting me. Alex Garland is a white dude from Britain. Alex Haley, he was a Nixonite.
If he wrote Roots,
that'd be a lot weirder.
Fuck that Roots.
But Alex Haley was a Nixonite Black Power person, which is so weird to us now. But Nixon was also flirting, as he was flirting with the Southern strategy, he was also flirting with trying
to get the black vote.
Trying to get the black vote and getting it into this idea of black community development and black capital.
That's what ends up fucking up James Brown. James Brown backs Richard Nixon.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. It even fucked up some former Panthers. Most of them had the sense not to fall for that, but not all of them.
Because that seems to be the rhetoric that I always hear, that we need money, we need access to capital, we need money, we need access to capital. And if the president's coming in saying, well, look, I'll give you the access to capital you need because I want to see black entrepreneurship.
But
and there you go.
You can't all be entrepreneurs. An economy based entirely off of petty bourgeois trade would fall apart. It wouldn't be able to produce anything. It wouldn't be able to produce enough, for one thing. The efficiencies of scale just do not exist. All right? Could the black community grow its own food under capitalism and still compete against the internet, not just against white people, but against the entire international market? There's no way.
And that's where I bring up the Democratic Party and neoliberalism and wanted you to give a definition on it, because an issue I have is we had a bill that passed. I think we talked a little bit about it. You and I did a show right after the election. Mm-hmm. Proposition 22. And what I was starting to notice, and I talked about this with Rob Larson on an episode not too long ago, is that there's such a negative connotation with a lot of people about the word employee.
Because people get wage slavery sucks. It's also not slavery, by the way, but wage slavery sucks. Yeah, we inherently know this. We all want to be our own boss. And if we can't be our own boss, we want a cool, nifty, creative job where we're not as alienated from the products of our labor. As a teacher, I'm slightly alienated from the products of my labor, but it's nowhere near as if I'm when I worked for
Papa John's
or Lowe's or any of those things, where I don't get anything that I make unless someone screws it up and leaves it here because they tried to con us out of money. And also, working at Papa John's is how I know that petite bourgeois profit margins are low.
Mm-hmm.
If you try to run an entire economy off that's going to be a subsistence economy.
But it's hard to explain that to people because, again, you've been sold this bill of goods that you can be your own boss and you have to be your own boss. And that's the only way you're going to really come up, is if you be your own boss. And being your own boss is great, especially in my community. It's all about being a boss. That's a term. You're a boss.
Yeah. You get to be your own boss. You get to have autonomy. You're not anyone's I hate to use a quasi-racist term, but you're not anyone's boy.
I thought you were gonna say bitch
or bitch, a quasi-sexist term. I guess we can pick which offense we're going to make. You're not owned by anyone. All right, now, and particularly that language in a group of people that have a very recent history of slavery in the grand scheme of things. That would have a pretty powerful motivator. I mean, people forget, but we are literally like what, 2.5 generations from people who would have known slaves.
Yeah. No, I get why the rhetoric is so easy to, but when you, and I know you don't live here in California, but the ads were just so, if this bill doesn't pass, then I won't be a contractor. And that's what I want to be. And, of course they're not going to say, well, the job's not going to change. Nothing fundamentally changes with your fucking job other than you get some worker protections that you didn't have beforehand. And if this bill passes, then I shall lose all these worker protections and I'll have less protection. And I'll get less money at the end of the day. And
yeah,
go ahead.
No,
it was just hard. It was hard to explain to people because it was so hard to cut through that whole rhetoric of being a boss. And everyone, and these are people that actually drove for Uber and Lyft. Every time you talk to them, they're like, I'm a boss. Why would I not want to be a boss? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, contractor law, man, is one of the most pernicious elements of post-'80s, neoliberalism in some ways. I mean, this is more of the Wild Westy laissez-faire world. I had a friend of mine who worked as a medical aide for years, and they got around giving her benefits, and all the stuff you're legally required to, even in a crappy white-to-work state, by claiming contractors, and no one really looked into it, even though it was patently illegal. So, that's one problem. The other problem is you're absolutely right, and that you have a fake consciousness threat, and you also have a real threat. And the real threat, a threat that I think is overstated in the case of California, because if you pull out of California, you're pulling out of like 1/5 of the entire U.S. economy. But maybe more than that. Maybe like 2/5 of the entire U.S. economy. But anyway, there's a double bait and switch there. There's both, you are not going to have the freedom, you're going to be an employee, and there's also, and we're going to do capital flight. So there is some teeth to the threat, but people don't see that the teeth is actually like, it's it's literally like abusing your spouse, or the threat is like, well, if you leave, you won't have a shelter, and also I can't hit you anymore. Like, but if I can't hit you anymore, then you won't have this nice house, and you'll have nothing, and that that is a lot of what like the gig economy has figured out how to play. And the gig economy is sort of the logical weird extension of this, right? Because they get out of all responsibility of being a boss by saying they're a facilitator. And yet they rake in tons of profits, and they don't even have to pay, in a lot of states, the state's minimum wage. They do not have to pay into the unemployment fund. They do not have to provide benefits. Yeah.
And that's what that whole bill was about. And the bill was flawed. I mean, it wasn't a perfect bill. I mean, part of the bill was that you couldn't unionize.
Yeah.
The AB5 bill that the gig companies were fighting. And it was such a blow because the next day after the election, I got an email from DoorDash CEO saying, congratulations, we won. Everybody chipped in, and we're going to take this all over the country. It's like, now this is what you were waiting to do. If we can win in California, we can win anywhere. And I don't think a lot of people that voted against their own best interest really understood the interest they were voting against, because they were so scared. Like, I got the same thing from people every time. Like, well, I can work 10 hours and make $400. That's going to change if this law passes. I was like, how? And they're like, well, I'm an employee. I was like, well, how? Like, what's going to change? Like, tell me, explain to me. If these people don't have the money to pay you anyway, you think they have the money to have an infrastructure in place to have a manager that's going to micromanage you all of a sudden? Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, I mean, they already micromanage them in a way. I mean, it's all done through disruptive control.
But it's that's hard to explain to people. But even just trying to explain just the bare basics, like, hey, it's just so you have these worker protections and it's bigger than you. Most people were like, nope, if this happens, I'm going to lose A, B, C, and D. And those ads were just beating you over the fucking head. And if you're not a person that worked in the gig economy and you watch one of those ads that was just every 5 minutes, you're like, oh, well, why wouldn't I vote yes on this? Because it sounds like it's all these people are endorsing it. Because the ads never said, hey, us at Uber and Lyft think you should vote for this bill that we're passing. That doesn't sound strange at all. It was always like, I'm a driver and I think you should vote for this. And by the way, the NAACP said it's cool.
And people might not know even why this has to do with A, capitalism, although that should be obvious, and B, neoliberalism. Let's get to what Uber, Lyft, and what them actually trade in. Mm-hmm. They trade in IP, and they exploit IP. Mm-hmm. All right? Now, even though the other thing they trade in is getting around labor laws by exploiting legal loopholes. Now, admittedly, a lot of the systems that they're at war with, for example, the taxi medallion system, were also broken. And that is something that leftists have to deal with. And I think most leftists want to. It's when you hear like Democrats trying to have their cake and eat it too, and they get all like misty-eyed about the New York medallion system. Do you know how much investment you had to put in to get one of those medallions?
It's like $1 million.
Yeah. I mean, it's also an exploited system over time. It's also a crap system. Like, so people who know that are like, well, I can choose between this crap system and this crap system. And these progressives are talking about how this crap system, the old way, was better. And in some ways it was, but in other ways it really wasn't at all. And the people in the system know that. So it actually ends up discrediting anything like progressive policy. And I don't think the Democrats deliberately do it, but there are days when I float the idea that they deliberately do it.
No, I remember the discussion about the medallions, and I also is it earlier this year or late last year when there was like maybe 4 or 5 suicides in New York from taxi drivers that had were making payments. It's like a mortgage, it's like a massive mortgage payment.
Yeah.
On these medallions, and they were getting undercut by Uber and Lyft, and they were working, hundreds of hours a week and killing themselves on the city hall steps. It was really horrible.
I mean, that is a worst of both worlds scenario where you have one exploitative system being undercut by another exploitative system, both of which are awful, and one of which is destroying the other. Unfortunately, that is a history of capitalism. But
and yes, and that's why I wanted to have you on, because ultimately, I think people want to know who the bad guy is. And in these conversations, like when it comes to medallions, you're going to say, well, it's the government. The government sucks. And then it's like, well, Uber and Lyft suck too. They are not your savior.
Why does the government suck? I mean, like, let's ask ourselves, like, I have some elaborate theories of state that I will spare you, but like, Why does the government suck? Why does the government co-opt on this all the time? Well, there's two basic reasons. There's one reason that's simple and one reason that's a little bit more complicated and harder to deal with. The first reason is politicians need money in a media sphere that eats money to have anyone know who they are, because the kind of electoral system that we have was actually based off of, one, keeping most people out of it in the first place, and two, it being based around fairly small communities, of which most people were kept out, who would actually personally know these people. Now, when you a pernicious, and I say this not being at all against democracy. Okay, people might hear me and think I'm against democracy and like secret ones, some kind of like socialist, technocratic, authoritarian. That's not what I'm saying here at all. But like in a mass privatized society where people privately own all kinds of things, even if like the airwaves are technically publicly owned because it happened before we were on a neoliberal kick. And they have all kinds of access capture from controlling the government. Well, how did they get that? And one is the people who established this government in the first place were property owners. Two, and they tried to make sure that originally that only, if you read the Federalist Papers, when they're talking about protecting minorities, the minority they're talking about are property owners. They're not talking about
me.
They're not talking about the people they just made a 3/5 compromise about that, they barely see as human. They're not even talking about like the poor white people who are leading Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. They are talking about rich people who own massive estates. And, one of the things I always point out about the Civil War, and the Civil War is one of the most progressive moments in our history, but it was a battle over two different types of property owners. Like, it's a battle over race, but it's a battle over two different kinds of property owners. Do you have free labor and, appropriated property from indigenous people, but and the property collected around that, or do you have massive plantains which have slave labor? Slave labor was hyper profitable for a long time, particularly when you added modern capitalist technology to it. But it was beginning to run out of its profit steams because, frankly, it's hard to make people who you compel to work with a whip work happily and with efficiency because they hate you. But also, like, that's why the Civil War was about slavery, but it wasn't even about freeing the slaves in the South. That is a myth. It was about the expansion of slavery, because the slavers knew they had to expand to be profitable and to compete with the industrial North. The industrial North, Lincoln makes this clear, actually, in his early speeches. Even if he was privately an abolitionist, he was totally willing to sell that out to hold the Union together, as long as he could protect labor interest in the North by not letting slavery expand. So you're having a competition between two types of property owners, right? It wasn't just a cultural competition between like people who thought that black people were human and people who didn't. That was part of it, but also if you read some of the abolitionists, even them, holy crap. Some of them are super racist. Some of it isn't most of them abolitionists, but some of the abolitionists would say stuff like, we are dirtying our shores by having, by intermixing the races, by forcing the races to intermix through slavery. If you go back and really read this stuff, and to be fair, that doesn't make people feel good. And it also, I don't say this to besmirch the Civil War as a progressive moment in our history. It really was. But that's not all that's going on. And it was one of these things where growing up in the South actually gave me a really good eye into this, because I knew that all those people who would talk about the war of northern aggression, of which there were still plenty when I was a kid.
They're still there.
Oh yeah, there was actually a concession in the cemetery that across my house where Flannery O'Connor is buried in Millersville, Georgia. And the concession was by the Daughters of the Confederacy to change the rhetoric on the on their pamphlets, on the Historical Society's pamphlets put out by the Daughters of the Confederacy on this cemetery, from the War of Northern Aggression to the War between the States. That was the progressive move. And that was in the aughts, just to put it in perspective. But the one thing I did know, though, is because they would actually dig up all this stuff where Lincoln would talk about how, he was going to he didn't care if slavery was maintained. And that was all true. He also had no problems with trying to have states under his control, trying to limit immigration of black people into those states. He had no problem with that. What he wanted, which created a problem in Africa that could be a whole nother conversation, was, to buy a parcel of colonial land, to give it back to the slaves and ship them all there, regardless of the fact that the slaves had been cut off from African culture for, between 25 and 150 years, and regardless of the fact that African culture, because Africa is a massive continent. I used to live in North Africa. Just to put it in perspective, it takes the same time to fly from Egypt to New York as it does from Egypt to Cape Town. So just keep that in mind. That maybe the indigenous people who didn't even understand that their land was being sold, didn't want this other group of black people who are not them to be thrown into their culture, thus creating an ethnic conflict that still erupted into wars 10 years ago. Oh man, I mean, what colonialism has done to Africa, but even Liberia, in its own way, which was Lincoln's humane solution to the problem that he wanted, ends up turning in this weird way, in a way that you would never even think. It ends up turning these former slaves into settler colonialists in their indigenous continent. I mean, it's nasty, but it's way better than slavery.
Do you think that was the tagline?
At least you're not a slave anymore. You're not going to get your what is it, 5 acres and a mule, but at least not here. You might get it in Liberia. Have a nice day. Have fun in this country where all the cities are weirdly named after American presidents.
Oh. And again, that's one of those things that a lot of people don't talk about, because again, I think the story of Abe Lincoln stops at the assassination for a lot of people.
I mean, Abe Lincoln was a progressive capitalist. I mean, even Marx wrote Abe Lincoln, encouraging him in the Civil War. But Marx also knew that he was still a bourgeois leader, and and Marx. I'm even gonna admit stuff that a lot of Marxists won't even touch. I'm gonna be honest with you. Marx and Engels were incredibly progressive and anti-racist for their time, but they were still bigots.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't say that to besmirch the good name of Marx either. They grew up in a certain cultural context. I mean, you'll have Engels saying things like the Slavs are not world historic peoples, and when they got in fights with each other, they would occasionally call each other racial slurs in letters, which they at least had the good sense not to print in public, because they wanted all people to be liberated. And all people for them did include Slavs. It did include Africans. But that doesn't mean that they did not have some of the cultural biases of their time. All right. And that is not to excuse it either. It's actually kind of make a point about when we talk about systemic versus personal racism, because Marx and Engels are some of the pioneers, particularly after they decide that imperialism's not all that progressive. All right. Well, I mean, originally they were like, oh, they're bringing technologies to these backwards people. I mean, they, like most liberals, they believe that and they realized, oh God, by reading about struggles in Ireland and then seeing it reflected back in India and Africa, they realized that. But even Marx and Engels started off with a lot of those same assumptions. Okay, and so what do you make of this? Like now is history is ugly. But it's all like you can make it more progressive because I think I think what Lincoln did, even if he didn't mean to do it, with the 13th and 14th Amendment, that's not just progressive for Black people. Honestly, it's progressive for everyone in the United States, and that's something you really need to understand. Before the 13th Amendment, the Bill of Rights didn't apply to states. They could do whatever they wanted to whomever they wanted. It's just the federal government couldn't. Now, a lot of states had their own Bill of Rights, but a lot of states didn't. All right. So the struggle for Black liberation in a very real way also helped out white people and poor white people in particular, and immigrants and people who were provisionally white, and all of that stuff in particular. All right. And in so much that the WASP elite, and not because they were WASP, but because they were capitalist, were able to play ethnic groups that were considered barely white, such as the Manx and Welsh miners against Black scab miners and what we would now call the Rust Belt in Ohio and Pennsylvania, because of racial rules, that thus pushed these groups that had no identification with WASP culture into whiteness, but also enabled their increased economic exploitation because of competition with another group that could be played off as an additional factor to lower wages and to suppress strikes. Black liberation has always been in white people's self-interest if they are working class. And even if they're peasants, even if they're adjacent to it, it is in our interest. But it is not necessarily in our interest to be sold a bunch of woke ads and have, United Colors of Benetton world. It needs to be actual Black liberation. Otherwise, we still undercut each other in the labor market. Like, and that's another thing I realized from working in the South. I mean, like, my life in the South I lived in a neighborhood that we had Black kids in our neighborhood, and when the neighborhood I was born in was actually majority Black. But I also noticed that, like, while the Black families in my neighborhood interacted with me, we did live in this kind of de facto semi-apartheid where we knew what it was okay to do and not say. And the only place we really mixed truly freely, honestly, was work. Even school, like even school, my classes were full of Black people, but like we set apart, like you would go over, you had Black friends, but you knew you didn't sit on the Black side of the lunchroom.
Did you have a segregated prom?
So this is interesting. My school was progressive for the area, and I'm putting that in quotation marks. So we did not have a segregated prom. We have an integrated prom because we had a public prom. We did not do what most of the schools in our area did, which was have private prom so they didn't have to be integrated. But we had a segregated prom court. Now, why would that have been? So we would vote for a Black and white prom king and a Black and white prom queen. Why?
Really?
Yep. Why did we do that? We did that because we didn't want to upset anyone by a forced miscegenated couple on stage. That ended in 1996. And you know why it ended?
Or was it a protest?
Nope. No one could figure out if Latinos. We had a canning factory open up in our area, and so our Latino and our Latino population increased like 50-fold, and our Asian population increased real fast. And I say 50-fold, it was like it went up from like no percent to like 10% of the population. And no one could figure out if the Latinos were white or black. I am not making this up. They just, because it was a binary system. And everybody was afraid, including some of the black community, that if we integrated the prom, there'd be riots. We finally did it and nothing happened. And we even, we did have miscegenated couples sometimes. Like, I think out of the 3 years after that, because this was my freshman year, I think it happened once. But you still had, there was competition. There was racial competition. But it wasn't the end of the world. But that was the world I grew up in. I grew up where like Jim Crow was still visible. My middle school was the old black high school. And we had a lot of black teachers, but our teachers are like, and actually we have trouble getting black teachers now, but you know where all of our old black teachers came from? They were integrated into the teaching population from desegregation. So in the 80s and 90s, we still had teachers who were teaching under the old segregated system and who had been integrated into the school system.
That's crazy. Because I told you before we were off air, I told Derick that I worked in the Gulf of Mexico, and the first time I heard about the prom thing, I'd heard about it maybe on TV or something, didn't think it was real, right? And then to meet people are like, no, that's our life, and it's kind of common, and it's just what it is. I was like, word? That shit's common? And hearing you say it, it's like, word? Like, that's just how it goes. There's the black guy's got to go get the black prom king, and but the prom was held at the same place.
Yeah, we had it at the same place, but that was actually weird. Like, that was weird for our area. So like, and we did dance together, stuff like that. But the schools around our area. So if you got out, because you got out of the area where there was more like right flight issues, are in the deeper south, in the areas that were not that were either, if you go to some of the towns and to southern and northern Georgia, you would almost have like mirror towns where like one town was, like Deep Step was white and Sparta was black. And they were both semi-rural towns, developed concurrently. And in those areas, you would have private proms so that they didn't have to be integrated. And that did not stop until the middle of the aughts. That was still going on during the Bush administration in some places.
That's so crazy. Do you know where Carrollton, Georgia is?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
There was I hope this makes you chuckle. So I did music for a very long time with my now ex, who is a Filipino woman from Canada. So she really had she knew that there's racism in America, but you don't really understand it when you've never lived it, right? So we're playing a show. We're supposed to play in Carrollton, Georgia. This is a bunch of years ago.
Yeah, on the Alabama border, right?
Is it? I couldn't tell you exactly.
It is very close to the Alabama border. I'm going to get into some weird Georgia regionalism some Southern regionalism that most of my friends don't even know. But we refer to all of the whiter parts of Georgia between down through the upper part of the Florida Handle is called Greater Bama. So
makes a lot of sense. Okay. I hope you chuckle. I'm saying this as we're recording. So we're playing the show in Carrollton. We're driving to Carrollton, and we had to take one of those. And I think we did leave Birmingham. It was like Birmingham and Carrollton. So we're on like a state route. So for those that don't know, it's not an interstate. So you have to drive through town.
Yep.
And as we're driving through this town, we've been driving for hours and touring forever, and we're tired and bored. We passed through this town. It's either called Whitesburg or Whitesville. I can't remember. It was White something. And they had all these antique places, and we're like, oh, let's go stop and go to the antique place. So we pull over on the side of the road and just start walking around these antique shops because we figured this is what we do anywhere. And it's kind of starting to hit us that we don't belong there because they're starting to get these really uncomfortable looks and people aren't greeting us as we're walking indoors. And, it's like, oh, okay. Yep. I know I'm not in the right place. So as we're trying to walk back to our car, and it feels like it's the longest walk in the world, right? And we're walking along this dirt road, and I hear very loudly from a pickup truck, "There they go, right there!" And this truck comes barreling down the road, pulls over in front of us, and both of our reactions are like, "Oh shit!" A week before, I had met a white guy that was a trucker at a truck stop in North Carolina. And somehow we got talking and told him I was a musician, and he had told me he lived in Carrollton. And I guess he was talking to his friend about this band that he met at the truck stop. And he happened to see me a week later walking down the road. And he was so excited that he was going to pull over and see me. So he greeted me. He got out of the car and gave me a great big hug. And, yeah, I thought that was funny.
Yeah, you have reason. I mean, there's reason to be afraid, though. I didn't realize until unfortunately Lovecraft Country how many even progressives in America didn't know the history of sundown towns, which were almost as common in the North as in the South. But Carrollton, luckily for you, is not one of them. But there's a town north of Atlanta that I think it actually had a black mayor now. But even when I was teaching in the Aunts, and I applied to work there, I was told to be careful as a Jewish person because it had a history of being a sundown town. It's one of the most famous ones. It's Cummings, Georgia. And one of my best friends was from Fitzgerald, Georgia, which we also did. Like, me with my segregated prom court, she would tell me about her segregated prom, and I'd be like, oh God. But so it's like, oh, it gets more racist. But she was from Fitzgerald, which was also a sundown town, and Inman Park in Atlanta was a sundown neighborhood. And it was a planned suburb. It was one of the first planned suburbs in the country, but it was a sundown neighborhood. So, the history of that was very much still alive and known as a kid. And when you would go apply for jobs or whatever, because I'm not Protestant, I'm not really religious at all. But my father is a rare species in combination, which is a working class Jew. That is rare. His parents had assimilated and converted to Methodism. He reconverted, then converted to Buddhism, and then later on became a weird Joel Osteen Christian. But that's a different story. But I would be warned about sundown towns because my family's multiracial. Like, I have Koreans and Black people in my family, in my extended family. So you'd always get this this place was a sundown town. You better be careful if you invite so-and-so or your friend or someone here, not because their life is in danger anymore, but because they're going to get a lot of shit because this is part of the culture of the area.
Yeah. Yeah. You're going to get fucked with by the police. You may not get good service in a restaurant. Like, it's uncomfortable. And that was probably one of the most frightened times I've ever had because I just knew right there. I was like, oh fuck.
Yep.
And yeah, I don't know if a higher power exists, but I think at that moment that motherfucker was right there going, please just don't kill this one today.
Yeah. It's we all had stories, growing up about the people who would disappear, on the freedom rides and stuff. I mean, again, because I had Black teachers who used to teach at the segregated schools. but they told us about that, like it's actually one of the things that I do a little bit worry about, that like James Baldwin brings up in his letter to teachers, right? And we started this conversation at the very beginning of this conversation. I was talking about bougie white choices, but I had I had enough of my life exposed to people who remembered this. Like my babysitter was a 70-year-old black woman. My teachers, a lot of them were in their 60s when they taught me in the 80s and 90s. About a fourth of our teaching force at the time was black, and we got a lot of these stories from them. So it was like a living memory that even as a working class white person, you had to know and you had to pick a side. Like, you couldn't really be neutral. Now, one of the things I didn't realize until I traveled all over the country later on in my life, I was married to a woman from Pennsylvania, and my mom, after she quit being a prison nurse, moved to when I was in college, moved to Ohio. Is that racism was different? And I live in Utah. Racism is different in these places. It is just as racist, but it's completely different.
Very different. Very different. I agree with you 100%.
And a lot of times,
very different.
People here will use the obvious and explicit racism that I grew up with as cover for theirs, But I was surprised that Georgia went blue, and I'll tell you why. I was surprised that Houston County and Cummings went blue for Biden, because Atlanta is a chocolate city and has voted Democrat my entire life. Macon is a poor city, a working class city, and also a chocolate city, and has voted Democrat my entire life. It has never mattered. All right. When the Dixiecrats left, they just handed the machine to the Black Democratic Caucus, literally, which is like, it's yours now. We're going to go be Republicans. Literally, that's what happened. All right. And I was surprised. I was not surprised in Atlanta. I knew the ATL was going to go blue. I was surprised that Houston County, which is a military city, and that the northern suburbs of Atlanta went blue. Because that's why that state flipped.
Do you think it had anything to do with the repulsion of Donald Trump?
I think it has a lot to do with the repulsion of Donald Trump. I have to think that also there have been a lot of well-off people of color. When I say well-off people of color, I actually mean Arabs and Asian immigrants who've come into the area and intermarried with the white families there. And I think also that the generation after mine's experience of racism is the kind of racism that came up after the backlash to Obama. So it was a very different kind of racism. And I also remember, as much as all this racial stuff that I'm telling you, about my childhood, there were things that I heard. I left the country and I would come back and visit Georgia when I would come back to visit my family. And particularly around 2011, I would hear things I had not heard since the 80s. And I started seeing Confederate flags again and all this stuff. And not in the heritage, not hate way. It wasn't even coded like that anymore. But when my experience of seeing that kind of stuff, I actually mostly experienced in the Rust Belt. Now, I don't want to sound like I have a lot of sympathy for the economic problems of Trumpists, all right? But I do have a lot of sympathy for the regions in which those people come from. Because if you look at, yes, actually, people don't really vote their class. Okay, that's actually somewhat true. But if you look at what most of the working class in America does, including most of the white working class in America, they have not voted for Democrats since 1964. Okay, true. They haven't voted in majority. They don't vote. All right? Just like between felon disenfranchisement laws, which also affects the white working class, not as severely as it affects black men in the South, but it does affect it. I mean, you still have, like where I'm from, 1 in 10 people are in the criminal justice circuit in some way. All right. And where I'm from, they can't vote. That is disproportionately black, but there's still, in raw numbers, tons of white people who are also affected. And I bring this up because, like, the working class where I'm from just doesn't vote. So people are like, well, white working class people are racist. I'm like, yeah, they are, but they're not like systemically racist, and they're not the people voting for Trump, even if they might be out there wearing MAGA hats. I don't know. All right. But they're not the people working for Trump. The biggest economic group of people that voted for Donald Trump make between $100,000 and $200,000 a year, meaning they aren't the rich and the bourgeoisie, but they also are not working class people in the way we understand it, and particularly when you correlate that with education, because most of them aren't college educated. What group of people can make over $100,000 a year and not be educated? They own small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And in a lot of ways, we have let these rural communities, particularly in the Rust Belt, be led by these people.
Mm-hmm.
That's who speaks for them. Because culturally, they look like them. They come out in pickup trucks. They're not college educated. They talk like them. But they're not actually the same class of people. It's blue collar kitsch. Like and yeah, they own jobs where you have to do physical labor, but they own those jobs. They own the capital for those jobs. And I don't think a lot of leftists have understood this when dealing with the divide. Now, I will also admit, like I said earlier, there is a divide of like hierarchy and authoritarianism and people that pretty much evenly spreads from egalitarian to hierarchical amongst all classes and all races. But the specific ideology that manifests is pretty particular. And that's what I don't think people are looking at when they're looking at like the problems of the white working class. And let's be honest, as things are happening in this country, the working class is at least 50% POC. It is slightly more POC than the general population.
And female too, right?
Yeah. If you want to look at the statistical dead average of the worker in America, it's a single mom who may or may not be of color. That's who it is. That's the statistical average.
That's my mom.
Yeah.
And she is now she's a leftist. She's a socialist that is a union organizer and a bunch of other stuff. Now,
my mom was an old Dixie crap, but she was also like she met the man I call my dad, who I love dearly, but he's not my bio father, but I spent a time of my life in that child of a working class of a working mother. I mean, a working mother who at one point was so poor and running from things that were pretty horrible. I mean, kinds of sexual exploitation, family violence, where our options were to live in a car, or to live, and then she eventually had her estranged ex-husband, my bio father's parents take me in so I'd have a roof over my head consistently. And her way out of that was getting married to the man who was called my dad. But like that's the reality for a lot of people. All right.
Yes.
I know we all think that like being free from the family is super progressive, and I'm actually in a low key way actually am a family abolitionist. Because I think it ties women into things that are really, really nasty for the very reasons that I'm explaining. But for the experience of the average working class person, the deracination of the family has been devastating. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another issue I wish we spoke better about. Like you can be a person who believes that we should be able to choose our families and have sexual freedom, and also admit that the experience of that, particularly after the 1970s, has been utterly devastating to working class women.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're stuck with domestic labor and having to work full-time jobs and having to provide somehow for their kids. Like, that's a horrible situation.
And that's the story of, every woman in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, your community, the Black community, is disproportionately hit by that, particularly after the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also sold, this Bill Cosby line of like, you just need better Black fathers. Well, no one's asking why there aren't better Black fathers, because there were Black fathers, taking care of their family in a somewhat patriarchal way, actually, in the 1930s. What happened?
Yeah. They just went away. That's the old school values got changed when the Panthers came. Socialist rhetoric. Is
sure,
that what it is?
That's what did it, right? Not the Chang gang, not looking for work and having to move around, not sure, that's totally, but yeah. I mean, obviously, right? I mean, it's one of those things where, like, I actually get why conservative rhetoric sometimes has some appeal to working class people, because even though everybody kind of knows, and I think most working class people kind of know it's a bait and switch, but like, I get it, because these experiences are horrifying. And when I would hang out with, frankly, my more likely to be left wing middle class friends, I would envy their life.
Yeah.
Of
course.
Yeah, and so, as I tell you the story, and so that people kind of get that I can talk philosophy all day, but the philosophy actually does tie into my lived experience. Now, I kind of distrust, this whole like narrative impulse we all have to like talk about, our multiple oppressions and traumas and all this. But in another way, like this philosophy is an answer to a real life problem. And it's a real life problem that a lot of us have. And for a lot of people, I think for a lot of leftists of color particularly, it is not an abstract moral problem, right? It is a problem of their daily lives. And I think for a lot of like, a lot of people talk about like the PMC and all this, and I'm not going to totally discredit that, but even those people are experiencing proletarianization in a way that has made them a lot more sympathetic to working class problems. And frankly, they're kind of working class anyway. They're just in a privileged part of it. But like college educated people, we were all sold college education as a way into a kind of middle class life, and it has not been that way. And they are experiencing high levels of debt, the inability to get homes unless they inherit money from their parents who frankly don't die anymore. And if they're boomers, now if they're in that Gen X boomer gap, they're actually, their life expectancy is going down. But until COVID, older boomers seem to be basically immortal. So like,
no, there's a lot of truth to that. Like that group of people not really understanding that the times they have changed. Having a conversation with an older gentleman that had bought a piece of property for $100,000 40 plus years ago, and is like, well, why can't you just save your money and buy a house? I was like, well, with the money that you were making as a job, you could save your money and buy a house. And mortgages at the time, I believe, weren't 30-year terms.
no.
So to buy a home and pay it off made sense. Like you could do that. That was understandable. You were going to do that. That was your reality. Now, if I make six figures, this home is now worth $1.5 million. The same home you bought for $100,000. How am I going to buy this house? And we're amortizing this loan over 30 years. Like it's a different game. Like trying to explain it to people that are older is kind of hard. Like you have to literally break it down to them with an inflation calculator and say, okay, now you're going to see.
Yeah. I mean, my grandfather, who was a bricklayer, brought a home for $1,000 and like $100 down.
Jesus.
Now that home is probably worth $150,000 now. It's in a black neighborhood in a poor part of Augusta, Georgia. But like still,
Yeah.
That is what is in effectively a ghetto, and what at the time was a mill neighborhood in the city of Augusta, and like we can't even dream of that. Like,
no.
I bought a home with my ex-wife. You know how I did it? I went abroad and served the richest people in the world.
Jesus.
And made $40K a year, but I lived in the third world and squirreled it away. And I was barely able to support my ex-wife through cancer and to buy a house when I was able to save half my income.
That's insane.
Yeah.
That's insane. And then we're asking people to do more with less.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you just not have an iPhone there, poor guy?
And it's one of those things where, like, you deal with men's rights activists and those kind of people who drive me up the wall. But, I'll tell you, like, I sort of get some of it because of the pressures that these property relations add to relationships. When I divorced when my second wife and I divorced, we had a house, and I left it to her because I knew that if we even split it equity-wise and sold it, neither one of us would ever be able to afford a house again. And I wasn't going to do that to her. But that was a calculation I had to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that to make myself sound good. I'm a dick. But, like, I'm just going to put that out there in the world. Like, I'm okay with that. But, like, these are calculations that even on fairly, if you're on the upper end of the working class, this is an unbelievable source of anxiety for you, because the only path you have to wealth at all is if you managed by hook or by crook to figure out how to get enough money on a down payment on a house, even though you don't really own that house and won't probably till you're dead. It's owned by the bank.
Yeah, and it would be so funny. I would and I don't want to go on this too long. So I did work in real estate finance and real estate for some time in my 20s and 30s or early 30s. And people come to me sometimes, they'd be like, "Oh, I want to buy a house and I've saved so much money." And I'm like, "Okay, well, how much do you have?" They'll be like, "I got $20,000. I'm like, "Okay, well, that's not as much as you think." But that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
If you squirreled away 20 grand, you didn't go out. You probably don't have the hottest fucking phone, and you know what I mean?
I was able to get a house in Utah by saving up actually almost exactly 20 grand with an FHA loan, which means your down payment is way lower.
Yeah.
Additional insurance has a penalty for doing that.
Yes.
And
mortgage insurance. Yeah.
Right. And also, like, the housing market in California has gotten so crazy it's even affecting us out here. So while it's been good in some ways I know working class families who bought, houses here in Salt Lake when they were like 10, 15 years ago, when they were like $100K and went into that form, and they are going to be able to sell that and provide for their kids that way. I mean, some of my Latin neighbors are definitely doing that, actually. But if you didn't, that's an accident of, like, you came, like, specifically during the housing crisis, bought a house then, have sat on it for 10 years, have not had any bad luck, then maybe you can use it to keep your wealth if you don't get wiped out by COVID.
Yeah, God forbid. And if you have a job with benefits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All those things.
That's a lot.
I always tell people, like, the fact that a teacher doesn't make a lot of money, all right, and actually, I want to point out, even on the national level, unless you work in Mississippi or West Virginia, or unfortunately, if you're a new teacher in Utah, unfortunately, but I'm not a new teacher, though, you actually are still in the upper 70% of income earners. Teachers don't make that much.
No, they don't.
You're in the upper 70% of income earners. What does that tell you? That's what people don't realize about America. Like, this image that we have that are the boomer parents, like the difference between boomers and everybody else is, to me, the one generational warfare thing that is sort of valid. And it is only because, one, most of the boomers that are poor are already dead. And two, and because poverty drops your life expectancy, or they got sucked into some war or another or whatever. And two, the boomers are the recipients of that wealth that fled in that I was talking about when we were talking about this all abstractly during talking about the precursors to neoliberalism, where the United States just was flush with the most money the world had ever seen on Earth. And it was going around.
You need to buy a house? Here's a loan. You want to buy this? Here's a loan.
We got all, we have 5% of the world's population have 50% of its wealth. We can be pretty profligate with loans.
Wages. Let's raise the wages up a little bit.
And I will also tell you that during this time period was the only time that when there was a downturn in the business cycle. It's between 1935 up until about 1961 is when, the business cycle still applied. If you had recessions between every 8 to 10 years. Guess who took the brunt of the cost of those? Believe it or not, the rich did for a while.
CEOs, yeah.
Now, I'm not saying this because the CEOs are greedy. I mean, they are greedy, but that's not why this changed. This changed because we are now, the United States, even though we're the world hegemon, even though we're the imperial core, we do not control 50% of the world's wealth. We control, yes, we control enough of it that the world has to trade in our currency. All right. Which is, as a side note, some of my problems with some current popular left economic theories, but whatever. I'm not going to go into that right now. But we do not have that real material wealth in the same way anymore. And, I don't think any one society ever should again. Actually, that should never exist. I don't want someone else to have, the 50s middle class life because some other country has captured 50% of the world's wealth through death, devastation, and a world crisis. I do not want that. All right. That is, in some ways, even though nobody in America, except for maybe black people actually, but nobody else in America really, really, really paid for this. And also to be fair, really also did the dirty deed to do it. I mean, yeah, they may have fought in the war, but they didn't know what they were doing. And also, I mean, World War II is one of the few wars that you can kind of maybe justify. But in a way, the middle class lifestyle of the 50s was blood money. That's why capitalism could be so profligate. The entire system was flush with the wages of being the sole survivor of a war where your own capital was not destroyed by bombing except in a tiny little part of a tiny little colonial island that you had that was technically a state, but, was one of the last, the most obvious and explicit colonial holdings, not to mention all the other secret colonial holdings we kind of have that, but obviously. That's the only, we paid for it in lives, you paid for it in destruction of boats, but that freed up capital. That created space for people to move. And I know that's morbid and dark, but there's a reason why they call the economics, particularly capitalist economics, the dismal science, because most of it is built on someone else's toil, labor, and particularly blood. So if we're going to do better, we can't do it that way. And this is actually my argument with a lot of the New Dealers, a lot of the current New Dealers people. I want a new Deal, but I want it for the whole world. Because if it's not the whole world, the only way to get it is the way we got it last time. And I'm not willing to ask any other country to pay that price.
Well, on that note.
Sorry, into the abyss.
No. That's the moment of the speech where everybody starts clapping, and where it's just me and you talking. So there's someone that's gonna hear this is gonna clap in their car, yeah, fuck yeah.
I can both go from real to impassioned didactic mode pretty fast, but
right on that Varn guy. Have him on again. But got me fired up.
I mean, I really believe that. And I really believe that for everyone in America. I want, in fact, I don't even want to think about it for everyone in America, right? I don't like thinking about this in terms of nations, because actually, if you game it out in a nation, you're always probably going to lose. It really is, in my mind, we all live in a just world, or no one does. Now, I don't even like talking about justice for that reason, right? Like, I think reparations is a great moral stance, all right? But I think logically it leads to things like ADOS. For those of you who don't know, African Descendants of Slave Movement.
Slaves, yeah.
Right? I think it is a moral and true stance. All right, but it leads to all kinds of other problems if you don't think about it in terms of reparations in a way that liberates everybody.
Exactly.
And that's the way. We all live in a just world, or no one does. And frankly, no one does. So, like, if we're going to talk about social justice or anything like that, it's got to be for every single person. Even my class enemies, once they're no longer of that class, deserve justice.
So
after all their stuff has been taken away from them and distributed fairly,
they distributed fairly. They've spent some time at the re-education camp,
but they too deserve justice and humanity. They just don't deserve all the stuff that they have inherited by even if it's not their own rapine that did it. I mean, like, I've had. I mean, I hate to tell people this as a socialist. I've had good bosses. It's rare, but I have. That's not the point. It's not moral like that. It's not moral in that kind of individualistic way.
So, kind of in closing for this whole conversation, we're going into the great unknown.
Oh, yeah.
None of us, our parents, didn't live through a pandemic.
A pandemic, a climate crisis, a constitutional crisis, and the world economic business cycle spiraling like it's on crack. Yeah. Not to defame the good name of crack.
This is a good name of crack. Where are you finding hope at?
Believe it or not, I don't find it in like arguing with leftists online, even though I spend a lot of time doing it. I find it in teaching kids. I find it in doing mutual aid programs. I'm not even sure that the stuff that I do in this regard, okay, is actually properly speaking even political. And this might confuse people. Like, I don't think you can fix society by mutual aid. It trains you to do certain things, to set up certain networks. It disciplines you in a way that is both disciplined and compassionate. And so it's a good thing for a leftist to do. It's not going to fix the world. All right. But you should do it because, one, it's a source of hope. Two, it's a source of really learning organization. And I know that I don't sound like it, as aggressive as I am, and the way I view history as basically toil and blood. But I actually do think people are, in the main, decent. And I don't mean this in a way like make America decent again. Like, I don't care about that. I mean that, like, most people, if they have the opportunity, now there are sociopaths out there, but they are rare. But most people, if they have the opportunity to be good, if given the chance to, and by good I mean pro-social, they will. If things are put in a situation of artificial scarcity and people are put in artificial competition, they will not be. And I can't blame people for that. But I take hope in the fact that first impulse is actually the majority one I see of all people, not just leftists, not just, oppressed minorities. It's actually everybody, if they think they can be that way. Now, in the frenzy of self-aggrievement and fear, that turns off. Whether that fear is from real material conditions or imagined ones, or in some cases a mixture of both. But I take a lot of hope in the fact that most people's first impulse is not, rip out the throat. Most people's first impulse, and I've experienced this around the world, is charity.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I've seen it. If I hadn't seen it for so many years touring in so many different places around this rock we call Earth, then I would try to find some reason to disagree. But I've actually seen people's propensity for decency. His name is Derick Varn. He's the scariest man on the internet. I'm letting you know right now. Don't dare show up on anybody's Facebook wall with some nonsense, because you will get the fuck slapped out of you.
Yeah, I kind of have that reputation.
Figuratively. He's slapping the fuck out of people figuratively.
Yeah. I no longer
believe... What is your podcast, Derek?
My podcast
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I don't. I no longer believe in literally slapping the fuck out of people. I used to. But I've grown up a bit. Now, my podcast is Pop the Left on Zero Books Network. I also work with the Emancipation Network and do a podcast which is really obscure, high-end philosophy on the left and historical analysis and science, actually, called Mortal Science, which is about trying to make the claims of leftists even something that could be kind of approachable to scientific. I mean, every Marxist and every social democrat and even every liberals, said this in different ways. The Marxists have the old school 30s Marxists had the most like hyperbolic rhetoric for this. Like, we are the immortal science, which is why we call our podcast Immortal Science. But even like liberals, you'd be like, we're the reality driven community,
the reality show community.
Yeah. But I actually, my projects are understanding left-wing history and the intersection of economics and stuff, going back, to ancient societies. And I do primarily focus on Western ones because that's the ones you're always taught. But I also am interested in anthropologically, interested in like African societies and how they compare. And, I'll make interesting arguments. Like when we talk about the ancient Greeks, I think applying like dead white men to them is a myth of dead white men, that they were not properly speaking white in any way, and talking about ancient peoples in that way doesn't even make sense. But, and that they shared more in common with North Africans than they did like weirdo Scandinavian Viking blood worshippers or whatever. But, but anyway, like, I think that you have to look at history and really understand this stuff. And that's what I do. I try to educate people for free. Although, I will admit I have adopted the cam girl model of making an extra buck. And it just,
you got OnlyFans?
It's the OnlyFans of my brain. So these podcasts do have Patreons, but the main stuff I hope will always be primarily free and probably without any advertising other than the advertising we do for the book company that we work for. So it is real. I will say, as a side note, it is real weird to work for a business that is also ostensibly left wing. That it leads to some really strange thought processes. But yeah.
I've had a few of the you talking about Zero Books, right?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, I've had a few Zero Books writers on. I'm at first I thought you guys were all like a clique.
Yeah, we're
like you guys kind of all knew each other, but I think you don't, because they're so spread all over the world.
Yeah, I knew Mark Fisher indirectly, actually before he died, and I've known Douglas Lain since arguing with him on the internet, actually, since 2011. But the rest of the authors, no, we're not really a clique. Like if anything, we've become friends more than we started out as friends. Ben Burgess and I are closer than we were before Zero, and but yeah, we're not really a clique, and like our political opinions actually range greatly. Like I think like if you were actually like paying attention to like what Ben Burgess says and what I say, we probably almost sound diametrically opposed sometimes.
Yeah, you guys sound very, very, very different.
Yeah, but that's the weird thing about the left wing world is it's both huge and tiny.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, like ostensibly there's thousands of people all over the world, or hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, and yet like I feel like I know like half of them somehow. Admittedly, I'm like you. I travel a lot, particularly before I moved back to the States. I was all over the world, but like it's still like it's weird that I know so many of them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so those are my two podcasts. I write books, mostly poetry actually, and although I am working on a book on the often mistook for a conservative, but he was not, Marxist thinker Christopher Lasch, who himself was really influenced by the former black nationalist Marxist thinker Harold Cruz. So, which is a connection people don't know about. Part of the book's gonna be about that.
I'm excited to check that one out. That's an interesting concept. Well, you heard there's going to be links to his show in the description. There's going to be links to any works he has out there in the description. Buy links. Derick, thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you for letting me rant for so long.
No, it's for me. This shit is fun. So I'm going to play some music. Don't hang up.
Okay.
All right, that was Derick Varn, the intellectual dynamo. I'm not going to lie, I was a little intimidated to do that show. I'm so glad that Doug Lain talked me into having Derick on. That was a good time, good talk. Derick had me on one of his shows recently, and this looks like it's going to be the beginning of a beautiful internet podcasting friendship. That being said, if you guys feel so inclined and you would like to help the show grow, we do have a Patreon. And we do create some patron-only content. And there's a lot of bonus content from many of the shows. There's a link in the description. Also, subscribe to the channel on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. Because we also do a live stream every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we have different guests. It's even much more looser than this version of the show, and you can see us in our natural habitats. We got some good stuff coming up this Tuesday. So even if you miss it, you can always catch it on YouTube. So definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this, listen to this. And I'll be talking to you guys soon. Peace.